This is a map I showed you before, just to introduce the situation where I'm going to pick up the story. The black outline is the present day border of Albania, which did not exist at the time of the Balkan War. It was a territory, but it was not a country, it had no army, no government, and the Albanians did not take part. They had no military force to contribute to the effort to drive the Turks out. It was all done by the Montenegrins, the Serbians, the Greeks, and the Bulgarians, who were operating farther to the east. But a lot of fighting took place on Albanian territory in these different regions. The Greeks in the south, the Serbians in the center, and the Montenegrins in the north. The creation of Albania is really due to the great powers of the time. Not to the Albanians themselves. They were not organized. They did not have a national, except on a very small scale. There were a few Albanian nationalists, but they did not have any organized force or government or independence movement going. The interests of the great powers were directly affected by the outcome of the war and the disposition of the territory the Ottomans had lost. Well, we're in the process of losing during the war. And so they called for a conference of the ambassadors. There are the ambassadors sitting at long tables in London. The problem they had was that they wanted to maintain the balance of power in the Balkans. They were extremely concerned about the Russians who were in the background, concerned about the Russians getting access to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. Now, Bulgaria and Serbia both laid claim to territory in Albania, what became Albania, and they were client states of Russia. So the fear was if this territory fell into the hands of Bulgaria and Serbia, who were both countries were desperate for an outlet to the Adriatic Sea, that would give the Russians a direct path. And the Austrians and the Italians and the Germans and the French and the British didn't want that. So the solution was to create a country, Albania, which would take up this territory and block the access of the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and in the background, the Russians. This summarizes pretty much what I've just said. What the ambassadors decided was to divide most of the Turkish territory between the four allies, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro, except for Albania, which was to become independent. Now, within the Albanian territory, there were four different authorities that controlled different portions of the country as the war was drawing to a close. In the north, there were military authorities that had been appointed by or approved, shall we say, by the ambassadors to control those territories. There was the Vlora government, which had been set up already in a port city, Vlora, to the south, although it only controlled a very small area. And then there was this fellow, Esad Pasha. Esad Pasha was a Turkish military commander in charge of the Shkodër district in the north of the country. But he actually left Shkodër. He turned it over to the Montenegrins. He essentially just walked away with his forces and set up he established control of the central territory, which was occupied mainly by the Serbs. He worked with the Serbs. He made a deal with them to set up his authority in central Albania, in Durrës and Tirana. And then the Greeks controlled the south. So here's a map summarizing what I've just said. Again, the red outline is the territory that became Albania. There was no border at the time, but just to indicate where the state of Albania was created. Central Albania, here's Durrës, one of the major seaports, and Tirana. This is the territory controlled by Esad Pasha. And we'll see later that he did issue stamps. There were stamps created for his original regime in central Albania, which he was forced to give up. But then he returned later, and that's a later part of the story I'll get to some other day. During World War I, he came back and reestablished a second regime in central Albania and issued stamps that actually were used for postage. Then the Vlora government controlled only this little area here. Here's Vlora, and Berat and Elbasan are two major towns that were under the jurisdiction of Vlora. And the southern area, of course, was occupied by the Greeks. What's outlined in blue here is the geographical territory of Epirus. The outcome of the conference by the ambassadors and the setting up of an international boundary commission, the consequence was that Epirus was divided. This was the dividing line. The geographical boundaries of Albania were pretty much established on traditional lines by these mountain ranges and this Lake Shkodër, and these lakes down here, Ohrid and Prespa. But the southern border of Albania was very difficult to determine because there was a mixture of populations. There were Albanians and Greeks living in this whole region. And the Boundary Commission carefully went from one village to another, determining what was the major language spoken, shall we say, on the street or in the marketplace. And so based on the use of language, they drew this line here. There were a lot of Greeks living in North Epirus who were very unhappy about being included in Albania. And for a time, they attempted to have their own independent country, autonomous Epirus, which I'll get to also later. I've talked about that in the past. But southern Epirus, on the other hand, became a part of Greece. This was all Ottoman territory before the war, but southern Epirus went to Greece.
Which Ottoman province was this area of Albania part of?
There were three different Ottoman provinces: Shkodër, Yanya, and Kosovo. The ambassadors took it upon themselves to create this country and declared that it would be a hereditary monarchy. It was very important. They wanted to set up a government that would not be beholden to any of the local factions. They had Vlora government, they had Esad Pasha, they had the Greeks, all controlling territory in Albania, and they wanted all of those forces and authorities to retreat and all submit to this new monarchy, which would not be beholden to any of them. They all actually ended up agreeing to do this. The Greeks were very reluctant to leave, but the others, the Vlora government and the central Albania under Esad Pasha, they were so eager to see that the other one did not come to power that they were willing to turn over the authority to the monarchy set up by this international commission. And the boundaries, as I mentioned, were to be drawn by an international boundary commission. And I mentioned about the difficulty of the southern boundary with its mixture of populations. Here we have on the left Ismail Kemal. He was at the head of the small group of Albanian nationalists who set up the Vlora government. They did this completely on their own. They didn't have any wide support. They had no military, but they arrived in Vlora at a time when the Turks were on the run. And so they were able to set up a government there, and they controlled a small amount of territory. And they were the source of the first Albanian stamps. In a past presentation, I went through a long list of stamps of the Vlora government. It's important to remember that although these are listed in the stamp catalogs as Albania's first stamps, they were really only valid in a small area, and the Vlora government did not last. The International Control Commission required that they submit to the authority of the new monarch. And so the Vlora government that had issued these stamps basically became a local government controlling only the small territory where they were active. These are two commemoratives issued by Albania in 1962. November 28, 1912 was when the Declaration of Independence was made in Vlora. by this group led by Ismail Kemal. 50 years, 1962, commemorates that. And this is the first stamp of Albania, that is of the Vlora government, which I showed before. And this is the one that's not listed by Scott or even mentioned, but it's the first Albanian stamp recognized by Michel. It's Michel I for Albania, issued in 1913. This is Esad Pasha, rather fierce-looking gentleman, and I might say very unpopular. He had his followers, but he was not a kindly person, and it was very, very rough and cruel people that were defeated by his forces. I saw, just by chance, I was looking at some websites about Albanian history, and there was a survey that was taken about Albanian leaders of the past and how popular they were. Ismail Kemal was on the list, Esad Pasha, and even Enver Hoxha, the communist dictator of Albania. Esad Pasha by far got the lowest ratings. Nobody seemed to like him. This is one of the Greek commanders who was in control of the territory to the south, General Spiromilios, commander of Greek forces at Himara. He was the one who was responsible for or helping to start the autonomous Epirus and issued those famous skull and crossbones stamps that I showed in the past. The control commission set up by the ambassadors required the Vlora government to relinquish its authority, same with Esad Pasha. And they chose as the prince, at the suggestion of Queen Elizabeth of Romania, her nephew, Prince Wilhelm Zubide, to ascend the throne of Albania. And he agreed. He studied the country to determine where he'd like to have his headquarters, his official government residence, and he chose Durrës, partly because it was central, and there was a direct access from Durrës to Tirana in the interior. He wanted to be able to retreat from Durrës to Tirana in the summertime during the malaria season. The coastal areas of Albania or at least at that time, were subject to outbreaks of malaria on the seacoast. So during the hot weather, he would take refuge in Tirana. This is Prince Wilhelm Zubide on these stamps. These stamps were created for use, by his government. He arrived in Albania on March 7th, 1914. The stamps were created but never issued, and his government lasted only a few months, only until September of 1914. By then, World War I was raging. The Italians were eager to take control of Albania, and they forced the king to leave. So these stamps were never issued. Later on, about 1920, after the war, they still had these stamps lying around, and the authorities in Albania at that time took them and overprinted them. They obliterated them with a double eagle overprint, which I've shown in the past, and I'll get to that later in this presentation as well. But this at least shows you a picture of our handsome king. Okay, now these are, we're back to some stamps I've shown you in the past. These were speculative issues made in 1912, but never used. I'm going to skip ahead now. All of these stamps here that I'm skipping through are issues of the Vlora government. They issued quite a few stamps for the few months they were in power, ending up with these officially produced stamps in December of 1913, honoring the great Albanian hero Georgi Kastrioti, known as Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander. Here are some canceled in various towns, and the stamps were issued with currency in quint and franken or francs, which was not a currency in use in this territory. introduction of the new currency was not successful. And so rather quickly, the stamps were overprinted in the Turkish currency that was actually used by the population. Para and grosh is the same as piastres. It's another name, I understand, for piastres. So actually, these overprinted ones with the Turkish currency are more common than the unoverprinted stamps. And as usual, of course, there are many errors in the surcharges. You get ones that are displaced and upside down. There's a little selection. The stamps were also overprinted for use as postage due stamps. And they use this term taxe or taxa, which is found in many other countries. When you look at postage due stamps, they'll say something like tax, or there's just the letter T. And sometimes the letter T is stamped on an envelope to indicate that postage is due. There were two different types of the postage due overprints. This is a set of Skanderbeg stamps overprinted on the occasion of the arrival of the king. King or prince, prince is more correct. Prince Wilhelm Suvid arrived in Durrës, Albania on March 7th, 1914. And we have the date there. Apparently, these are printed in two operations. First, the printing on a diagonal line of the date, and below it, this text, which that's the word for prince. I believe it's arrival of the prince. And the two dates here, there's one 1467 and then 1914 over here. The 1467 is a commemoration of the death of Skanderbeg. This is an attempt, I guess, to tie this great hero of the Albanian resistance to the Turks, Kastrioti, to the new prince taking office in 1914. Now, these are the stamps created for the regime in central Albania. These have recently been added to the Scott catalog. The one on the left here is overprinted, and this overprint was not made until Esad Pasha's second regime later during World War I. I don't have any examples of this stamp without the overprint. This one I do. These were also overprinted later, but here I have one that doesn't have the overprint. The unoverprinted stamps were never issued, but they were prepared, and this says Government of Central Albania in Albanian and also in French, Albania Central. And Tarabash is the name of this mountain in the background here. This would be Shkodër, Lake Shkodër, and this is the fortress at Shkodër. This is where Esad Pasha had been holding forth as the commander of this region before he abandoned it. But since he had ties to this area, apparently those who created the stamps thought that it was an appropriate subject to be used. I'm getting most of my information about these stamps from a book that I showed before by John Phipps. And he has the following comments on these stamps. They were printed to the order of private promoters by this firm Modiano of Trieste that was also responsible for that other issue that I showed that was that never was used. The printing was financed by the promoters out of their own resources in the hope that adoption of the stamps by Esad Pasha would give them official status with the stamp trade. So you can see what's going on here. The very creation of these stamps was done by people who were eager to take advantage of stamp collectors and get something out there from central Albania. It wasn't Esad Pasha's idea in the beginning. And he decided not to use the stamps because by the time they became available, he already was, he foresaw the need to come to terms with the International Commission to end his separate regime in central Albania. Okay, that's it for now. Stay tuned for further episodes.